Hello, today we are going to talk about what is a tort. And one thing it is not is a cake. So we spell tort, T-O-R-T, and it is a civil action. So it's a civil lawsuit for injury to person or property. And the key I like to think about for torts, and this is, my philosophy I'm sharing with you all, is that we really think about the reason behind torts. More than any other area of law, I think that torts reflects public policy. How do we want citizens to be, and how do we want them to behave? And remember, down the line, we're talking about civil liability if there is something that goes wrong, and it will be a jury of your peers that gets to decide what was reasonable and did this person act reasonably. So when we do it that way, we have this common sense that's kind of imported into the decision and making sure that we hold our fellow citizens to the standards that we would like to have ourselves be held to. And that's why we have a jury of our peers in a tort. So, just as a quick one, I like to think of torts as having two main purposes. One is, of course, to compensate the victim for the injury. And so, whether it's psychological injury, whether it's a physical one, we want the victim to be compensated by the person who's responsible. We hold that person legally responsible, the one who caused the injury, whether intentional or not. And then the other piece is that when we are compensating the victim, we're also sending a message both to the tortfeasor, which is our cool word for the one who committed this tort, but also to others out there so that we are very careful in the future to not take that action. So we kind of prevent torts from happening that way. We prevent injuries. And an example of that, if you have your neighbor leaving the garden hose across the front walkway, of course, well, presumably they're not doing it intentionally, but that person is in the best position to make sure that there was not a garden hose in the front walkway. And therefore, we want to hold that person responsible. And in the future, that neighbor and others will make sure that they inspect their property and make sure that there are no hazards. And that prevents injuries from happening. So there's an incentive that's built in. The other thing is when we do damages, when we look at damages for torts, we say, well, what's the purpose? To compensate the victim, who's the plaintiff in the case. And also, sometimes in special torts, we want to punish the person who is the perpetrator, right? The one who hurt this victim. And that's going to be reserved in only special situations. We call that punitive damages. So punitive damages, just like they sound like, they're to punish. And because of that, that's not involving hospital bills and things that compensatory to compensate somebody for their economic loss and for their medical bills and maybe lost wages. That's compensatory damages. Punitive damages, whole other purpose, much like crimes. And that's actually one of the reasons why we talk about torts, at least in our introduction, when we're in a chapter about crime, because there's that punishment element if somebody does something really bad. So for intentional torts, not mere negligence like the garden hose incident, but for intentional torts, we are going to have the potential for punitive damages. And that's a jury question. If the judge or jury feels that this is a situation that warrants punitive damages, that makes it possible. So if it was something really bad that the person did, and remember, this is the defendant now, or if it was what we call gross negligence, which is an idea of like recklessness. Another definition for that is wanton and willful disregard for human life. If somebody were to drive a car and go through a red light, let's say, and cause an accident, that would be negligence. But if the person, while doing so, is drunk, then we use words like gross negligence. And notice that ties right back to crime because the very same incident could also give rise to a crime. I say give rise to is up to the prosecutor, but they might charge that person with vehicular manslaughter, which is, of course, a very serious crime. Or even if it was done intentionally, it could be murder one, murder two, with a vehicle. But even manslaughter has in it that recklessness, the idea that you could hold somebody criminally responsible, in which case, as we've discussed earlier, the penalty would be jail and possibly a fine. So it's that punishment again. There could be punitive damages as well. And that's what we do for our torts and how they tie into crimes potentially. And remember what I said at the beginning of the semester, you could also have a crime and a tort meaning that you could have a criminal action, a prosecution, and also a civil action, a money damages lawsuit, right, from the victims for the same exact incident and does not violate double jeopardy. So there is part of the link now between crimes and torts. And we'll have further videos on types of torts, but that's just sort of our letting you have a kind of a big picture of the purpose and how this fits into the framework of our legal system and what we want our citizens to do in their actions and how we enforce that through the law. Talk to you later on this and other subjects. Bye-bye.